There we go. So Will and I have worked together for a number of years through a lot of the regional study stuff. So we organise a webinar series together as well. And then to give the background on Richard was one of my PhD supervisors. So I feel we all very cosily know each other here, which is rather nice. So the sort of structure of today's presentation is requests to stay on mute so we don't have any unfortunate sort of interventions. My neighbour has just had an industrial wood chipper turn up, so if there's any strange noises, I'm really sorry about that. So yeah, keep yourselves on mute. There's obviously the option to pose a question in the chat or do a question later on. We're going to go with the structure today of that Will do his presentation, followed by my presentation, and then afterwards we can do some questions and conversation and see how it goes from there. So then obviously this webinar seminar is part of the wider series of the Patch seminars, which is a Pan-Wales network looking at establishing joint research interests in place-based approaches to climate change. So on that note, I'd like to ask Will if you'd like to share your slides.
Right, yes, I'll have a go. That was the first fun start part of this. Anyway, try and pick the right one. Does that look right? Is it showing you?
Yep, that's the presentation.
Fabulous. Okay.
Fantastic. I'll mute myself now, but obviously if there's anything you need, just let me know.
Great. Okay. Hopefully that continues to look good. Nice to be here today. Thank you for inviting me along to speak. I'm going to speak about work I've been doing over the last few years with a number of different colleagues, looking at how new energy economies, particularly around decarbonisation, are impacting on industrial places and are having implications for how industrial sectors are organised too. And particularly interested in those places that are in different ways, perhaps socially, economically or politically marginalised, and that have been kind of labelled left behind places often over recent years. So just very briefly, this comes from a series of different projects. I'm trying to tie together today some themes across a series of projects. Hopefully that kind of works. You can tell me afterwards if it doesn't. There's a series of projects over the last few years, all focusing in different ways around these economic geographies of energy transitions and industrial places across Western Europe, really, particularly Sweden, UK, and Spain as well. And the key sets of questions or analysis that's been involved across these projects and that I'm trying to draw together here is first around how we position places within political economic geographies and uneven development in relation to energy transitions and the resulting new energy economies that are resulting from that. And second, from a place-based perspective, understanding what the implications of those broad processes are for places, and in particular thinking about the interaction between the economic and the cultural politics of industrial change and energy transitions. So broadly speaking, working to this framework, I suppose, or I'm trying to pull out this framework now really around the interaction between the political economic aspects of change and the cultural cognitive aspects of change and how the two interact. And the reason I think that's important is partly because, particularly in kind of economic geography circles, often the cultural and cognitive aspects of change aren't adequately thought about or accounted for, in particular how the cultural and cognitive aspects make a difference to the political, economic and vice versa, and how those are mediated in different ways through considerations around well-being and materiality too. So, as I said, this research has looked across a number of places, and I'm going to draw a bit on a few of those places today. There's a list in the table here of some of the places we've looked at across Scotland, England, Spain. Work in Spain is ongoing, as well as in Sweden. And in some ways, each of these can be thought of as left behind places, perhaps due to, as I said at the start, peripherality in terms of their geographic peripherality, but also marginalisation and that has been exacerbated by industrial change over the last 30, 40 years. We chose these case studies, although they're for different studies, some of them. They've been chosen and brought together here because they reflect different industries. So we had 3 that are based in the steel industry, 2 that have been based in petrochemicals, 2 around coal, 2 also around the different implications for industries of new energy economies in those places, whether it be around growth, decline, or closure, uncertainty, and so on. As I said, they're all in Western Europe. There's a concentration, England and Sweden, but we've looked in Scotland and Spain. We're also doing some further work with a colleague in Italy at the moment around change to the steel industry in Italy as part of one of our projects. So I'm going to try then to pick out some shared themes from across these cases. Obviously, there's loads of variation between them, but what I'm trying to do here is think through how we might sort of conceptually draw together some of the changes around that, the interactions between political, economic, and cultural, cognitive dimensions of change. Here's a map, just because I'm a geographer and it's nice to have a map, but it gives you a sense of where each of the places are, broadly speaking, that I'll be talking about. Doesn't tell you much more than that, but there you go. So, moving on to key themes. So, as I said, risk of repeating myself again, I'm going to be trying to draw together, first of all, understandings around what the political economic geographies of energy transition are, and then tie those together with the cultural and cognitive dimensions of change and how they interact. So starting with the political economic geographies of energy transition, we know that energy geographies, new energy geographies are creating new economic geographies, and that processes of industrial restructuring are ongoing, and they're unfolding in different sorts of ways with different impacts for different places. Can talk about ways that we're needing, or places and industries think about how they can hold down or renew energy intensive industries, how new resource geographies are growing around these new the decarbonisation processes, for example, whether it's around good sites for renewable energy, whether it's around storage sites for captured carbon, whether it's about new needs for new mineral sources, or even within existing extractive processes, for example, iron ore needing different sources of iron ore that are more suitable for changing decarbonised processes. And of course, all around this, then new technologies and growth sectors are growing. And these all overlap, often operating in the same places in different ways, but combined, they create processes of uneven development, just like all other periods of major economic restructuring have. And they layer on to those previous periods of economic restructuring to create what Bridge and Galen have coined as uneven and combined development, drawing more broadly from longer-term interest around uneven development. So the question for us was, for me and the people I've been working with, is, well, what do these processes mean for industrial places, and in particular these, what we might know of as left behind industrial places? I'm going to skip that slide. I should have hidden that one. So in order to do so, to think about to the extent to which new energy economies and new industrial pathways in places might have implications for the development pathways of those places, if you like. We need to take a step back and look at how the relationship between industry and communities has changed really over the last 40 years, or perhaps slightly longer than that now, when we talk about 50 years. And that historical view gives us a sense and understanding of the industrial dislocation that has happened in places, a long-term process whereby industry has dislocated from places. And I've got an example of Grangemouth here, which was built around oil refinery and related petrochemical and chemical industries. In Grangemouth, we've seen a decline in employment over time, but not a decline in the industry itself until very recently anyway. And so the outputs from that industry, the negative externalities in terms of light, sound, air pollution, have all been experienced by people living in the place, but with a decline in employment and kind of less experience of the potential trade-offs or benefits of those places. Not only because of reduced employment, but also because of changing labour markets, which mean people don't tend to live as close to the place they work as they used to, which has impacts on the place. More broadly, though, we see withdrawal from the socio-cultural fabric of industry from places, no longer providing welfare services, social services, and so on in places that had grown within places, partly because of demands of workers, but partly in order to ensure that there was a healthy workforce and, I guess, to work in places. And so you can see from those quotes there what that means to people in the places, in Grangemouth in particular. Obviously, alongside that, we've seen a fairly uneven or incomplete set of state initiatives and welfare to bridge some of those changes and gaps. So we see this industrial dislocation over time. So that's important background, I think, for when we start to think about how new energy economies are coming to ground in industrial places. And so even when we start to think about energy investments and potential growth potential in these places, it's important to think about that longer term context. So through these newer low carbon energy investments, for example, in hydrogen and carbon capture and storage and electrification of industries, of new energy technologies, renewable energies, and so on. We are seeing alongside those, of course, official visions of economic success being produced, the potential for renewing these industries that have perhaps undergone decline, or at least relative decline, over the last 40 years or so, and creating new potential economic pathways for places. And we see that particularly in the kind of favoured, if you like, regions, for example, in the UK, the Humber, Teessides, South Wales, and so on. These stories of potential success, the promise of jobs and skills and of revitalisation and of skills programmes to support local workers, and so on. And this is for the stuff on the slide here is from a kind of infographic produced by the Humber Industrial Cluster. The question for us was, is there evidence of place renewal alongside that? And it is early days, of course, so perhaps it's too soon to be pronouncing these on this. But we aren't really, in the places we've been looking at, seeing that evidence of place renewal, or that the new investments are going to relocate industry within places. In particular, and this is a common story of modern capitalism and economic development, I realise, but the local state is often being bypassed or placed in a facilitative role around these investments. There's that reduced local capacity to act, in part, particularly in the UK, a function of severe austerity experienced over the last 15 years or so. But this then layers on to the processes of dislocation and disembedding that we've seen historically. And so here the quotes are from Grimsby in Humber, where they've had, for how many years now, 10, 15, almost 20 years perhaps of investment in offshore wind, but they're locally not really feeling those benefits because of how the corporate structures in terms of ownership, in terms of who owns the infrastructure, in terms of where the jobs are going, for example. So that dislocation remains despite investment. And so you get a dislocation between the kind of surface impacts and what it actually means for people in place. So now I want to join that kind of political economic view of change to how that interacts with the cultural aspects, cultural cognitive aspects of change, and to think about how we then interrogate the logics and desires behind change, the role of meaning and identity within that, and how they then join up the questions of and shape political economic processes too. And there's a nice quote here from a paper by Jackson in 1991, quoted in McCann in 2002, around the fact that we can't divorce cultural aspects of economic development from the apparently political or economic dimensions. And I think we still haven't fully addressed that in much of the work that goes on, particularly from an economic geography point of view. So I'm going to talk about this in three ways. One is around how cultural and cognitive dimensions interact with political economic in terms of cultural projections, often official projections and performances. One around how around cultural resistance, and a third one around ideas of cultural dissonance. So on this slide, talk about some of the logics of development which shape industrial pathways, and they're as much cultural as economic constructs. And this one example here is from the Humber region. And we can see the logic of development here, how they're focused around, on the one hand, abstractions of regional jobs and GVA, and focusing on extending or revitalising industrial path development paradigms. And then we see a production of imaginaries of a green estuary in the Humber, and the visualisation used to territorialise and tie these abstractions of jobs to place, to give a sense of this is a thing for the Humber, and tying it very much to the industrial past as well, to create visions of future prosperity. So there's a particular way of performing this industrial change as something that belongs to the region and creates benefits to the region. And that's very much a cultural project and projection as much as it is around economic change. But then the next example I'm going to draw from is in Sweden, and we can see how these kinds of logics can lead to quite visceral cultural responses that can create challenges for industrial development plans. So as I said, this is in Sweden. This is around Luleå and Boden in northern Sweden, which is a particularly strong example of this. So in northern Sweden, there's huge amounts of investment going into fossil-free hydrogen-fueled steel production, which is fueling a new phase of industrial development right across Sweden's northern counties. Here, hydrogen's replacing coal in iron ore reduction process. I won't go into the details of it, but it's just kind of useful background, especially because green hydrogen production, so that's hydrogen produced through renewable energy sources, is being used here to make the most of potential for hydropower and wind power across the north. But this potential for fossil-free steel is leading to expansion of iron ore mining activities and large-scale renewable developments across these northern counties, and creating quite a complex, geographically extensive pathway that's been developed. So it has wide-ranging consequences, from labour migration, impacts on national energy systems and so on. But it's also impacting on traditional economic activities of the indigenous Sami population in northern Sweden. And Valentin Fogel and Georgia DeLu, who have recently published something on this, have written about how the North lands here are being represented as visions for green steel as a kind of terra nullius, as a land empty and unclaimed and void of history prior to its supposed discovery as a location for extraction and industrial development, ignoring the history and cultural history of the place in many ways. So this is seen, and there's a quote on the slide here, seen by some in the Sami community as really being an assault on their very existence, and there's resistance being developed around that. So the key points here around understanding how historical conditions can allow one economic pathway, one way of viewing land and space to override the needs of another, but also how industrial development is a more than economic process. It's shaped by, has implications for deep-seated spatial-temporal identities, heritage cultures, and so on. So we can see how the political, economic, and cultural processes are entwined, and in this instance, producing points of resistance. And obviously, this isn't the only example, but it's a particularly, I guess, visceral example that comes from our own research. Third one, and I'm going to wrap up after this. Third example is around the notion of cultural dissonance. And this is particularly, well, it's come out across all of our case studies, and particularly perhaps in some of the steel communities we've been in. But there's some quotes up here. So we've been unpicking how this cultural dissonance is at play, and I suppose it starts through how we think about how identity and memory and heritage have produced certain cultural path dependencies, I suppose, in places around powerful industrial identities, often very male focused productivist identities, and the symbolism of the industrial plant alongside that. But these are held in parallel to understanding that actually we understand the process of decline, perhaps have some nostalgia for what's been in the past, and a sense of realism, really, or perceived realism, that industrial renewal won't actually solve the problems of place and the problems that people are experiencing in places. And what this, in many of the instances of people we're speaking to, creates a sort of narrowed set of options, if you like, in terms of thinking about hopes and desires for the future. It's often about survival, not getting worse, and bound by this industrial imaginary, which can't envisage kind of real revival and growth or change. So the real challenge there, and this is not just, this is across from policy perspective, perhaps even from an academic perspective and through to people who work and live in places, is how do we support hopeful or transformative imaginaries for people and places in these experiencing these changes. So finally, just to move on to conclusion and to tie some of this together, I realised that was a very whistle-stop tour between around a range of examples and ideas. But so we're seeing these uneven patterns of investment and disinvestment. We see industrial places in many ways are places of paradox and of dissonance, but really where the places where the politics of low carbon futures are coming into focus. Importantly, to understand the geographic implications of energy transition, we have to look at the historic and economic cultural processes that lie behind those too. And we're looking at these long-term processes of disembedding, of economic extraction, of labour market dislocation. And I guess what we have to be aware of is that these aren't automatically or fundamentally altered through new energy economies. So a new low carbon industrial pathway does not necessarily mean a new development pathway. And perhaps we're in some cases locking in places to what are quite problematic development pathways. So there's a challenge to address the cultural and cognitive dissonance in workers, communities and policy. And there's a well-being argument for this. There's also that political argument around risk of backlash to green transitions. And we've heard from other academics around the idea of the revenge of the left behind places and what have you. So this search for alternative economic and cultural visions is really critical for the future well-being of decarbonised industrial places. Probably gone on too long, so I'll stop there. Thank you.
No, that was perfect. I was about to give you a 3-minute warning, so we're
okay.
Oh, Geraldine's got her hand up, so if you'd like to fire away.
I was just clapping, sorry.
Oh, clapping. Me and technology, wonderful. Well done, yes.
Right.
That does kind of go when you do webinars, doesn't it? But does anyone have any sort of burning questions for Will now?
I don't have questions. I just wanted to say I'm really sorry I have to disappear. And I really, really enjoyed the talk. It was really important work and very much in line with a lot of the thinking that's going on in this research network and in my own work as well. And I'll have a look at your publications and I might be in touch. So thank you very much, Will. And good luck with your talk, Laura. And we'll be in touch. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Nice to meet you. And yeah, please do get in touch if you want to talk more. It'd be great. Thank you.
Did you have a question, Richard? Or should I move on to my presentation and then we can discuss after?
Yes, I think we're going to do both and then ask questions to both. Is
Yeah,
that still
fine,
the plan?
Yeah.
That's fine. There might be commonalities, so I'm happy to go with that plan. Is that looking like a presentation? It is.
It's just the PowerPoint screen at the minute rather than the presentation.
Is that now a presentation?
Yes.
Yes. So the first time, this is an experiment today. I'm actually doing a presentation whilst having the two screens on because then I can see people's faces and see my slides at the same time, which works a little bit better for me. So my research is sort of working within this multidisciplinary space. So looking at the sort of place-based approaches to net zero technology. I'm just going to put my timer on because the clock isn't displaying, just to make sure that I'm not running over. So this is looking at place-based approaches to net zero technology innovation. And this is really sort of, the Will, you're looking at this sort of a lot of the changes that are taking place within the steel industry and whatever, and looking at decarbonising those sectors. And this is focusing on decarbonising shipping, but it's also looking at doing it through using new fuels and new alternative fuels. So there's a lot of sort of contestations around those different systems, but I'll get into those now. So this is part of the Marine NH3 project. which is an EPSRC funded project. So it's a strongly engineering basis. I lead on, ostensibly I lead on theme 1 acceptance, but specifically I look at the legislation and the socioeconomic work packages. So my role within this is trying to understand the socio-technical, the socioeconomic system around facilitating green ammonia. And this is sort of within then a broader team of engineers, chemists, physicists, who all talk a completely different language to me. So that's that remains an interesting challenge 18 months into the project. But within this, we have sort of project partners that include sort of the IMO, so the International Maritime Organization, Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. So they're sort of very key institutions and policymakers within the marine space and within the alternative fuel space. So this work then feeds into sort of conversations with them on this basis. So green ammonia is a maritime fuel. It's a good idea in long haul shipping. It has a nice low steady burn, and can be fitted to the retrofitted into the internal combustion engine. So one of the main sort of benefits of it is that you could run it on conventional fossil fuel for one day and then switch to ammonia. So sort of you can balance your sort of supply and the fuels that you're carrying. The time frame within which this is all working is the IMO's aim of at least, it's quite a gentle target of at least 80% reduction by 2050, but importantly includes well to wake. And it's important for ammonia, that green ammonia, that it includes the well to wake, because over the whole life cycle of production and distribution and storage, ammonia becomes one of the more competitive marine fuels and the alternative marine fuels. But at the moment, as with much of new technology, there's been a pacing problem, where the development of the technology is vastly outstripping legislation, and the market is currently being used as a default mechanism. But there's conservative estimates of 35, and this is by Lloyd's Register, so who are one of the major market commentators within shipping. It is conservative estimates of 35% ranging up to 79% of the market being green ammonia. So it's one of the few technologies that sort of market forces are pointing towards it having a high likelihood of success. Whether this is paired with, you mentioned hydrogen, Will, for steel and steel production, whether this is paired with hydrogen, because hydrogen can be cracked, ammonia can carry hydrogen, and it can be cracked to produce more hydrogen, or whether it's ammonia as a standalone chemical, that still remains up for debate at the moment. But the problem with utilising a market system to facilitate new technology, there's some factors that are obviously causing an impediment. So, currently you're looking at 200 to 300 times more costly for green ammonia over fossil fuel. There'd be a global investment of around $6 trillion to decarbonize 40% of the vessel, the international shipping fleet. No one is advocating that ammonia would be fitted into every vessel, and certainly the position of Marine NH3 as a project is that whilst we are investigating ammonia from an engineering and sort of chemistry perspective, the work that I do is very much technology agnostic, and it's with the appreciation that there is going to be space in the marketplace for hydrogen, biomethane, ethanol, battery-powered vessels. In fact, there's been an announcement of a battery-powered ferry within the last week or so. So there's definitely, it's definitely a situation where there's going to need to be multiple solutions to be able to achieve decarbonisation, and particularly if you're looking to achieve it in the time frame of 2050. Ammonia, liquid ammonia, is energy dense, has lower storage costs than hydrogen, because hydrogen does have to be stored at a cryogenic temperature, which obviously increases the risks with its storage. But the snag is that it requires 3 to 4 times the space of fossil fuels. So looking at that, a lot of these are going to be vessels that carry goods and services, losing sort of ship space and losing deck space is one of the problems. there's a supply and demand dilemma. This sounds like I'm saying all negatives, but it's to give you the context of, you know, the difficulty in getting this pre-commercialization technology going. You know, there'd be currently around 3 times the current production required, but there is 20% redundancy in the system, and those plants that are producing brown ammonia using fossil fuels could very easily retrofit to utilize renewable energy. One of the main costs, and in fact probably the most major factor in the cost of green ammonia, is the cost of renewable energy, which to me I think is very interesting. I think all of us study sort of linked innovation systems, and, you know, Will, your presentation certainly sort of talking about how, you know, those for the SAMI, the knock-on effects of all the other different sectors in pursuing one sort of thing. But the renewable energy costs are prohibitive at the moment. But as they reduce and as input increases, then you're going to look at a leveling. So it's currently thought that around by 2030, 2035, we'd look at the levelization of costs between ammonia and fossil fuels based on sort of legislative timelines and things that are to be introduced. But all this obviously negates that there will be demand from other sectors. So there's going to be refrigeration, who currently use a lot of ammonia for the cooling processes. If they were to switch to green ammonia, obviously that would increase demand. Farming, obviously, one of the major utilizers, and one of the reasons why there is such a large infrastructure of those that are habituated with dealing with ammonia, which is obviously another really important bit. It's a skilled sector to work in, which again has our implications on our regions as we go through. So in the last year, my sort of job, because there is no legislation that specifically addresses the use of ammonia as a maritime fuel, has been looking at the legislation that surrounds it, to have sort of surmised what future legislation might look like. And the sort of key factors are controlling risk, occupational safety, because ammonia is toxic, but you can smell it. So if you could smell ammonia, then you would know you were in a dangerous situation, which is, I'm assumed, is assured as a positive versus hydrogen, which would explode. There's the impact on the environment, if there should be a spill, but there's been a lot of modelling done around that it is a lesser evil than an oil spill, because of the nature of the chemical, the storage, and this is sort of where the regional basis certainly comes in, and then shipbuilding legislation. And this we'll see as well, multiple levels. And I should mention this sort of, there's going to be multiple territories of legislation that overlap, and in order to be able to facilitate this change. So key barriers to acceptance would be other maritime fuels. There are those that see that it's going to be one fuel or another, but others that advocate, like we do, that it's going to be a multi-fuel mix, multi-fuel options for the future. And the economic, the renewable energy availability, governmental support, the level of production, experimentation and scaling, getting the green ammonia on vessels, because it can be fitted in the internal combustion engine, but obviously there's the storage, and as they say, bunkering, which is basically filling up the ships with fuel, and supply chain infrastructure. So that's a whistle-stop tour of the sort of background of what sort of the place-based approaches are going to have to deal with. And this is because there's legislation that's been introduced to develop green shipping corridors, and this is the principle behind this is to facilitate local experiments and then look at scaling these operations. It's part of the Climate Declaration in COP26, and then this was reinforced by the COP28. There has been a UK-US task force elected, but at the moment it still remains early days and there's not much coming out of that. And there's 6 proposed shipping corridors to be operated by 2030, and with the view that this will sort of try to marry the global with the local and then rescale it again to the global. And we link in sort of places of power for sort of experimentation and scalability. Now, there's an interesting paper that's come out. So Maersk McKinsey, who's one of the sort of large shipping operators, has been analysing the sort of multi-scalar interaction between the different EU and US policies. And it's viewed that with the overlap of the different regions and their different regional approaches to sort of legislating around the environmental impact, legislating around their shipbuilding, etc. As part of these shipping corridors, it looks like that by 2030, including the Fuel EU, the EU ETS, environmental trading system, we're looking at that by 2030, the sort of economics of green ammonia will marry out. That, however, ignores the fact that there has to be supply chain and there has to be demand and the production that matches this. So using a place-based approaches to enabling change, it's trying to understand the process of leading to technology acceptance. Because like you were mentioning, Will, you know, how communities have this decarbonisation or deindustrialisation or changing of industry put upon them can influence how it's received. So ammonia itself, as I've said, is toxic, but it needs to be produced. And to produce it, obviously, this is likely to happen within communities that are located within ports. So I had been hoping to have some really hot off the press, just baked evidence for you, but then a general election was announced and everyone wanted to postpone their interviews to after the election. So I will go with the secondary data that I've gathered and let you know from there, but maybe I can give you an update at the time. I laugh because this is one of the things in working in this space, especially the new technologies. It's very politically associated. But we're looking at how we structure this for more effective policy intervention. So part of our conversations has been with policymakers to see what kinds of evidence that they would need and part of this is we're filling in with how communities would like to see it approached to be able to be more receptive to these changes. You know, we all are seasoned geographers and economic geographers. We're all very appreciative of the sort of regional economic development benefits from pursuing sort of innovative technology. And, you know, as it's being extensively discussed, a lot of these areas are sort of left behind or they are deindustrializing and you know, losing industry, not losing the industry, just losing employment. And I thought that was very striking what you said in your presentation, Will, about sort of, you know, people still putting up with the same stinky externalities, but still having less employment. So, you know, sort of still bearing the brunt of, you know, the particular industrial sort of pursuance, but paying the costs as well. So the role of ports. So this was sort of my typification of the socio-technical system around green ammonia, looking at green ammonia specifically and sort of not looking at the renewable energy socio-technical system on which green ammonia is very dependent. Now, those that are highlighted in red are those areas that the ports are responsible for and will have a factor in controlling. And what's interesting in sort of approaching the ports is we all tend to think of ports as being this sort of single actor that is a port, but when you look at them as places of sort of activity, there's quite a large number of things that the roles that they must fulfill. You know, they're very strongly integrated with the region and with their communities. A lot of people are employed there, and a lot of people are dependent on their activities for their employment. They also have a very sort of strong intermediary role. From the research I've done within marine energy, it was the ports themselves that did sort of a lot of facilitating between different sectors in order to sort of progress industrial development. And in the sort of green ammonia system, it's a situation where the sort of ports are going to have to balance two key sort of decarbonisation narratives. There's one, the decarbonisation that they must achieve themselves as a port, which is looking at, you know, how do they reduce their sort of carbon footprint from dockside activities, from their own activities. You know, Bristol Port's a really good example that they're doing a lot of sort of nature-based solutions in order to sort of, you know, address particular water issues or you know, there's a high level of sedimentation in Bristol Port as well. So there's things like this that they're using nature-based approaches. So there's the decarbonisation of their own operations, but there's also the decarbonisation of things like the shipping industry. And for the shipping industry to decarbonise, the kind of support that they need from a port is for them to be able to store ammonia at the least. If they can produce it, that would be even better. That they have the ability to bunker ammonia, so they'd be able to supply this to vessels. And then also the port would be sort of the I nearly said protocol then, oh dear, would be the point of contact for then addressing these sort of issues with the community and ensuring that there's sort of a smooth introduction of the technology. So within this is sort of my conclusion, and I think I'm going to open out, seeing as I've got the opportunity, seeing as my interviews got delayed, is sort of opening out the questions of things that you think that should be explored by both of you, three of you. I know have done a lot of research within this. So there's some of the references of the reports and the Ottawa. There we go. Has that ended it for you? Yes.
No, still showing. Sorry.
It's okay.
Yeah.
Does anyone have a question that they want to start off with, or comments? Yes, Richard.
Both your presentations. I think the question of how local places work in wider sustainability transitions, both in terms of being impacted, also feed back into the dynamics of those transitions is really critical. And I got a lot from both presentations. There's lots of things I could explore. But to start with a question that might bridge both your presentations. I wondered how far the ability of local people, local actors to debate and steer alternative directions of change in these places is shaped by the fact that in all these kinds of places, there are particular industries, particular actors with a lot of control over land, space and planning. Whether that's the ports on the kind of debates about ammonia and your stuff, Laura, or some of these major industries own a lot of land, a lot of spare brownfield land, and maybe sitting in planning designations that allocate them for special industries, which kind of, you know, if you like, pre-grooms them for accepting more of the same kind of activity. I mean, is that kind of control over land, space and development science that give these sort of actors a key ability to shape future development in a way, and also give some leverage which can marginalise alternative perspectives on how places might change?
Did you want to take that first?
Yeah, sure. I think that's great. I've not really directly thought about land, you know, materiality of the land, I suppose, and how it's owned. I think that's really something for us to pick up, because we keep talking about materiality, and I think we've thought more about the pipes and the buildings and so on, and not so much actually the land it all sits on. So my answer to that is thank you, because it's something for us to think more about. I think we've recently been doing work in Stocksbridge, which is just north of Sheffield now. It's kind of been historically an important site for specialised steel production, and they own the steelworks there owns probably about half of the valley that it sits within, but actually what it's meant there is that they've been able to control things like what they sell the land for, rather than, and they've sold it for shopping developments and things like that, and kind of what's the word, sort of speculative investments, as opposed to perhaps more, I don't know, community-led kind of schemes that might return the space to other sorts of uses. So yeah, anyway, yeah, so my answer is yes, I need to think more about that, but yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I think that's, I was just trying to Google something, the joy of doing. I think an example would be Kenfig in Port Talbot. From what I understand and I remember, Kenfig Nature Reserve is an outcome of sort of like the demands on Tata Steel to sort of utilise some land for the community aspects. So if you go to Kenfig, it's an absolutely stunning beach, as long as you turn your back to the steelworks, and then you've got, you know, you could be on a beautiful beach anywhere. But I think there was something in that it had to be sort of attributed to that. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think this is something it's giving me, whilst it's frustrating to not have been able to do my interviews in the last few weeks, because you do gear yourself up towards these things, don't you? I think that's something interesting to be thinking, because I mean, the ports particularly as well, there's like a lot of complexity with some of them that are sort of, you know, that they are trust ports like Milford Haven, so they have sort of higher expectations on them to serve the community and sort of have that future generation kind of outlook to what they do. And then there's others then that are private ports who sort of have different demands on them. So the plan is to look at multiple ports to see how they sort of are balancing these decarbonisation goals. But yeah, I think it's thinking about how they use those spaces, because obviously like a nature-based solution that, you know, Bristol Port have done a lot of, nature-based solutions often take more space than sort of, you know, from what I can see from what they've been telling me, is that's taking more space than if they'd use alternatives that were less sort of, you know. So yeah, no, I think the use of space and how that impacts the community, and I guess in flipping that as well, might influence how the community receives this new technology. Because if you could say, well, there's this new technology, but you gain, you know, at the same time. Yeah, thank you. I was replying, Richard, for a question.
Sorry, Laura.
Yeah.
While you were speaking, I remembered that when, you know how you remember that you haven't thought about some of this actually, but in a different way. So some of the work we've been doing has been around hydrogen, carbon capture and storage. And actually there's a really critical example of kind of who controls space. And when you think about marine space and the disconnection of the planning process for offshore planning as opposed to onshore planning, and how that means that local communities don't really have any kind of say or kind of part of the or gain from the benefits, because it's the Crown Estate largely that controls all the North Sea Transition Authority and how they control this process. So yes, we had good to remember that we had thought a little bit about it, but definitely great to be prompted to think a bit more on that. Yeah.
Yeah. Just get my note, because I did have something that I wanted to speak about with you, Will. But I was interested in what you're saying, like the cultural cognitive aspect and sort of, you know, the male identity on industrial activities as well. And that was interesting because we found that when we were looking, so not this project, a previous project I was working on, which was steel decarbonisation in Port Talbot. And there was very, very large gender pay disparity within Port Talbot as a region. But when we asked people about it, they didn't seem to recognise it. And it was really interesting to me from that approach that it wasn't, culturally, it wasn't seen as a sort of a problem, but then there was the hope that in the future that things would be more balanced. So it was just interesting that sort of to pick up on that idea of how we could maybe use these transitions to sort of address some of these disparities that are sort of evident in a lot of these regions, you know?
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. Yeah, so because we were doing sort of oral history interviews with lots of people in our steel, one of the projects in the steel project. And it was interesting to hear the kind of how the story of place was told through the men's experience of work, even from the women that were talking about it. And you had to kind of not prod the women, that wouldn't be appropriate, but provoke them to talk a little bit differently, you know, to think about their own experience, their own family experience, and then you sort of got a sense of the difference of experience in place. But also, I guess, how that it also meant that, and we know this from what broader stories about industrial change, that how then women were kind of in industrial places were able to access the new labour markets that opened as a result of shifting economy, and actually then became a more geographically mobile kind of group within the labour force. But also how the stories within the plant, I'm thinking, because it's most recently we've been in Stockbridge, so I'm thinking about our conversations there, the stories are still very male kind of oriented, very much. I think they, you know, you say, oh, are there many women working on the time? Oh, we had one, she stayed for a while and then she left to do something better. Do you know what I mean? Like, other than in the administrative kind of part. So there's still a very strong gender division of labour, and it's not easy to see if decarbonisation is about extending existing kind of industrial activities, it's not easy to see exactly how it addresses that. But it's more, you know, you need other interventions, but there are other opportunities, and we've started doing work around retrofit. I think retrofit's a really good example of where you can, because of its fairly diffuse nature, it creates all sorts of opportunities for doing things in all kinds of different ways. At the moment, obviously, at some point, it'll probably there's potential for it to get locked down again by either large-scale state intervention or through monopolization through one or two big providers. But at the moment, we've got that space of opportunity to create new cultures and economic possibilities. So that's what we're working on at the minute. Sorry, that's a slight tangent, but yeah.
I have a question for everyone. Obviously, so the joy of doing the EPSRC projects is that it's a program grant. So we design our research year on year, and so this year is looking at the ports and looking at the communities. Now, coming sort of, you know, we are sort of, I think Will and I are probably the most similar in disciplinary background, but you know, generally we're quite multidisciplinary here. Sort of, what aspects then do you think we should be looking at when we're engaging with communities about new technologies? You know, we talked about this sort of gender issue. What else is there that we should be thinking about that perhaps will get us, you know, different outcomes to, you know, this technology has less carbon, therefore, you know, it's notionally the thing we should be doing.
After instrumental insights or sort of intellectual insights. I always think that in terms of the relationship between technology development and places, there's always a kind of strong methodological distinction between asking people purposefully ask people what they think about something that might happen in a place and gauging their views on it, and understanding how they think about that place at present and things are going on about it, whether they think about it on a day-to-day basis at all. Because yeah, people are polite. If you ask them a direct question, they'll give you an answer. But it's not to say these things necessarily bulk large in their presumptions about place, what happens in their place, whether it's the sort of thing they ever thought they'd have any control or impact over. And knowing the methodological difference between those sorts of things is very important. To give an example, you could ask, I don't know, people in North Bristol what they thought about something that might or might not go ahead on in the wider Avonside industrial complex, what they thought about hydrogen, that'd be fine. But but to ask them more neutrally what their local place is like, what features in it, might reveal that they have no expectations to engage in or control what goes in that space at all. Because as long as it's over there, they control it. They do that kind of stuff. Smoke comes out, it makes noises, there are lights and so on. But yeah, I was simulating the idea this is not a place I can walk in, visit, control, or in any other kind of way. So it's always the difference between knowing how people feel about a place and things go on about it in general versus asking them specifically about what they think about a particular kind of technology. I guess you might also, I guess it's also unpacking local publics. They may also engage with places as employees, for example, who works there rather than simply spatially contiguous, spatially nearby residents. We often sometimes over-reduce the two. What's it like to work on a place where something's hazardous now going there? Something possibly more different is going on next door, for example, just unpacking those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think that. I'm sorry, Laura. Go on.
Sorry, this idea of resistance, I think, is we asked about resistance when we did the Talbot study, and no one seemed to be that sort of motivated for sort of like the resistance in the decarbonisation. They just saw the decarbonisation that needed to happen. Steelworks aren't as important anymore, so, and it was kind of a very nonchalant attitude, which is very different to what is portrayed in the media, which I think was interesting, because Tata is very much, the whole of Talbot would lose its identity and, its sort of recognition if it didn't have the steelworks. But I think Talbot has a lot more going for it than just being a site of the steelworks, But sorry, what were you saying?
Oh yeah, well no, I think that's very interesting, because there was a headline again today, I think, about Talbot would lose its meaning to exist or something like that. It's a bit like that quote I did in my talk, like about almost Talbot is steel and steel is Talbot, and yet so something. So that's something that's, and I think it relates to what Richard was saying, is unpicking the point to which, where do these things actually figure in people's understandings of place, and they're kind of, are they? I sometimes wonder when we're speaking to people in Steeltown, they're expected to think that their identity is around steel, but it isn't. Maybe it isn't really. Do you know what I mean? So that's a very glib sentence, perhaps. But do you know what I mean? They're saying what they're expected to think about the place, or the kind of shared story of the place, which might not be the same as their own perception of the place.
Just a quick intervention, 'cause I'm expecting a knock on the door for student meeting at 2. I guess the other way in which we relate to these things, it may be much more important than their positions as local citizens, is as voters, the extent to which people with very different views of energy transition can mobilise people as voters to be for or against things, which they may be spatially contiguous or not. And I guess what I think, I may have misheard it on the news today, but it could, this may be right, but the SNP sort of points the finger at Labour is going to, not do as much as they will to keep the Grangemouth refinery going. That may animate people in Grangemouth. It may animate some people in Scotland more widely. And there are other environmental resource conflicts which are being pulled upon to mobilise very different views about national policies and politics for transition in a way which is potentially much more powerful, given how centralised the UK is, than what people may feel as citizens on a day-to-day basis, I think. And so how places exploited, at a wider reach through people as voters will be much more powerful. I mean, English wind farm policy, if that's a good example. Yes, there's some place-based conflicts, but its ability to achieve UK-wide electoral and policy salience that made the difference here, including from people that may not be at all directly affected. Reform reform, campaigning on, digging more coal, for example, is another example of that.
Yeah. No, that's excellent. Well, I can see we've hit 14:01, so that's that was us. Thank you very much for that. Obviously, you all have my email address. If you want to get in touch with Will, I'd be happy to do that also. But yeah, thank you very much. I've had a really good conversation. I got some new points for additional questions that I need to ask people. So I guess that's a really good outcome for an hour, isn't it? So thank you very much, and hopefully see you in sort of future patch seminars as well. And obviously, if you ever want to join our RSA webinars, you're very welcome to. Okay, brilliant. Well, thank you very much, everyone. I'm going to press stop on the recording.